Welcome everyone to the Rosemont MFA reading series for March. I think it's March. Thank you all for coming. This is going to be a terrific night. Our first reader this evening is Kristina Moriconi. Kristina is a poet and essayist whose work has appeared in a variety of literary journals and magazines, including Brevity, Terrain.org, Lumina, Ruminate Magazine, and Literary Mama, as well as many others. Moriconi earned her MFA from Rainier Writing Workshop in Tacoma, Washington. She teaches in the Creative Writing MFA program at Rosemont College, and she was the 2014 Montgomery County Poet Laureate, as well as a finalist for the Kurt Johnson Prose Award for Creative Nonfiction from December Magazine. Please welcome Kristina Moriconi.
Stalemate. Walking home every day from elementary school at lunch, I stopped to pour my carton of whole milk down a sewer drain along the way. At the beginning of the school year, I'd asked my mother if I could sign up for chocolate milk, but she said no and sent in the form for white milk instead. And so our battle for control began. The milk a preamble. The conflict at our kitchen table would be far worse. 5 o'clock every night, neither of us willing to compromise. It started small, lima beans, at least once a week. It was a textural thing for me. They were chalky, and by the time my mother had taken them from a bag in the freezer to the table, they'd been purged of any taste they might have once had. It shifted to liver and onions. Then, almost daily, to some kind of bloody meat. Ropey tendons and ribbons of fat running through each slab. Roast beef, lamb, tenderloin. Steak was my father's favorite. Top round, bottom round, flap, skirt, strip, flank, ribeye, London broil, T-bone. It didn't matter how small I cut them up. I chewed and chewed, but the pieces of meat never seemed to get any smaller. As often as possible, when my mother wasn't looking, whatever had been in my mouth ended up in a napkin on my lap. I wasn't allowed to leave the table until I finished everything on my plate. Meat was expensive, my father reminded me. There were starving children in the world, my mother proclaimed, often. It was the late 70s. I don't know how much information was out there about the risks of creating disordered behavior in your children, but I do know those hours at that kitchen table, alone, sometimes long after dark, willing myself not to eat, set the stage for a lifetime of struggle. I learned then, and I learned well, how to tame the hunger in my belly, to fall asleep listening to the grumble. My mother got our week's worth of meat from the local butcher. I went with her. I had never seen my mother giddy before, but she looked and sounded like a young schoolgirl around this man behind the counter. She called him by his first name, Heinz. He spoke with a thick German accent my mother once told me she loved listening to, and she always bought whatever cut of this or fillet of that he recommended to her. I didn't know exactly what flirting was back then, but I'm sure now my mother had been doing exactly that with Heinz the butcher. She always left that market smiling, seeming a little lighter, our bags weighed down by meat wrapped neatly in brown paper, tied up with white string. Years later, near the end of my mother's life, she moved into an assisted living community. She was happy to have someone to cook for her. I didn't realize how much she'd never actually enjoyed cooking until my father died and she stopped making meals, unless they were frozen and came from a box. Once she moved into the manor, she quickly got used to 3 meals a day being prepared for her, and she quickly became picky, demanding, sometimes almost combative about what it was she would and would not eat. She made a list. Chicken, boiled only, unseasoned. Rice, white, overcooked. Baked potato, plain, preferably twice baked. Vegetables, steamed, but not asparagus or Brussels sprouts. Of course, I thought back to my childhood and our kitchen table, to the hours I'd spent fretting over foods I didn't want to eat. I never said anything to my mother, though. There was no point. I lifted her knife and fork to slice the dry, bland chicken breast on her plate into small pieces, exactly how she wanted them. For me, by now a vegetarian for decades, this was an act of love. She never thanked me, but that was my mother. Thanking me would have been an acknowledgement of need, and that would have meant, for her, giving up whatever illusion of control she was still desperately clinging to. Before she began stabbing her fork into the perfect cubes of chicken, I removed the white linen napkin the dining staff had fan-folded and placed inside her wine glass. As it unfurled in the air, I couldn't help but think of that moment as a gesture of surrender. I set the napkin in her lap and smiled. So, staying on the, thank you. I just have one more flash piece to read. Okay, I have enough time, right? Staying on the theme of my mother, this one's called Mother Trees, and it's one I work to bring in some research, or for those in my class, outside voices. And there's also segments, so I'll use my prop again. In the front yard of the house where my first marriage eventually ends, the V-shaped limbs of 2 oak trees have been bolted and cabled together, their trunks prone to splitting under the weight of their canopy. Outside that house, beneath those trees, I am 7 months pregnant when a bee stings me. When red hives climb my limbs, my trunk, make it harder and harder for me to breathe. Anaphylaxis occurs within minutes of exposure to an allergen. I do not know I am allergic. This is how I find out. I almost deliver my baby that day, 2 months too soon, shot up with something to hasten her development, her growth, to better her chances for breathing on her own. Survival outside the womb, I overhear someone say. And for the first time, I think of the 2 of us as wholly separate beings. Each year, a tree forms new cells arranged in concentric circles, growth rings. Springwood, when the growing season begins. Summerwood, when growth slows down. Old rings closest to the center form the heartwood, inactive cells, the dead part of the tree. 2 months later, when my baby is born, my mother's labored breathing begins, her cough and wheeze, the gasps. Air inhaled flows down the trachea to bronchial tubes that look like upside-down trees. The heartwood of my mother's body, scarred, darkened by tar, cells and tissue starved of oxygen. I am there when her chest rises, falls for the last time. A landslide, her lungs flooding. Trees have a heartbeat, scientists discover, their trunks and branches contracting and expanding in slow movements that mimic a pulse. A dendrologist is a scientist who studies trees, their taxonomic interrelationships, their growth rings, their leaf shapes, their grain. My own interest in trees is deeply rooted. It becomes a preoccupation, a need to know more, a connection with something larger than myself. At the cemetery, I lower my mother's urn into the ground, thinking how light it feels as I bend toward the notched earth. I am holding my mother. I am holding my mother. I am letting her go. With my family, I release white balloons, their strings each carrying a message we'd written to her. Almost immediately, the 3 balloons I let go of tangle in a nearby tree. For months, years, they stay there, my words dangling, so much left unsaid. Somewhere I read about mother trees, about a forest ecologist whose research shows how the carbon mother trees pass to their kin through roots and fungal threads can increase seedling survival by 4 times. I live now among trees, some hundreds of years old, the youngest one brought with us, replanted on the day we move into this house, a dwarf maple, The Mother's Day tree, my daughters call it. This front yard, its third home. This Mother's Day, its 15th. This year, my first without either of my daughters here with me. I feel emptied somehow, alone, though I am not usually that kind of mother, maternal in a way that risks despair. Perhaps my nurturing had been more practical, a way of preparing them to leave the nest, to survive even long-distance flight. I think about the language of trees, the alliteration of the wind through their leaves, whistle, whisper, whoosh, how their trunks and limbs shelter stories, store them inside circles, inside circles, inside circles. Death surrounds me. My grief, quarter sawn, rift sawn, turned into something else. The weathered wood of a bench not far from my mother's grave, the splintered wood of a nesting box, the worn surface of my mother's kitchen table, a repeating pattern of circle stains from her cups of tea, the polished mahogany of the casket that holds her body before the urn, the wood of olive branches carved and sanded into rosary beads clasped in her hands. Thank you.